Hello and welcome to Mahatma Gandhi Letters. Dear listeners, let's continue the article, The Indian Franchise, an Appeal to Every Briton in South Africa. Gandhi continues. Mr. Henry Binns gave his evidence to the following effect before the Commission, page 156. In my opinion, the free Indian population is a most useful section of the community. A large portion of them, considerably larger than is generally supposed, are in service in the colony, particularly employed as house servants in the towns and villages. They are also considerable producers, and from information which I have taken some trouble to gather, I conclude that the free Indians have grown about 100,000 maunds maize per annum for the last 2 or 3 years, besides considerable quantities of tobacco and other articles. Before there was a free Indian population, the towns of Pietermaritzburg and Durban had no supply of fruit, vegetables, and fish. At present, all these things are fully supplied. We have never had any immigrants from Europe who have shown any inclination to become market gardeners and fishermen, and I am of opinion that but for the free Indian population, the markets of Maritzburg and Durban would be as badly supplied now as they were 10 years ago. Were coolie immigration to be permanently stopped, the rate of wages payable to European mechanics would probably not be affected one way or the other, but in a very short time after such stoppage there would cease to be as much employment for them as there is now. Tropical cultivation never has been, and never will be, carried on without Indian laborers. The then Attorney General and present Chief Justice thus gave his evidence before the Commission, page 327. In my opinion, numbers of the Indians who have been introduced have in a great measure provided on the coast for the failure of white immigrants, and have cultivated lands which would otherwise remain uncultivated, with crops which are of real advantage to the inhabitants of the colony. Many who have not availed themselves of the return passage to India have turned out to be trusty and useful domestic servants. That both the freed and free Indians have been very useful to the colony generally can be proved by still more overwhelming proofs. The commissioners in their report at page 82 say, they show commendable industry in fishing and fish curing. The Indian fishing settlement on Salisbury Island in Durban Bay has been of manifest advantage not only to the Indian but to the white inhabitants of the colony. In numerous localities in the upland as well as in the coast districts, they have converted waste and unproductive land into well-kept gardens, planted with vegetables, tobacco, maize, and fruit trees. Those settled in the vicinity of Durban and Pietermaritzburg have succeeded in winning for themselves almost entirely the supplying of the local markets with vegetables. It must be that this competition by free Indians has worked to the prejudice of those white colonists who once had the monopoly of the trade. In fairness to the free Indians, we must observe that the competition is legitimate in its nature, and that it certainly has been welcomed by the general community. From an early hour in the morning, Indian hawkers, male and female, adults and children, go busily with heavy baskets on their heads from house to house, and thus citizens can now daily, at their own doors and at low rates, purchase wholesome vegetables and fruit, which not many years ago they could not with certainty procure even in the public markets, and at exorbitant prices. As to the traders, the Commissioner's report at page 74 says, we are convinced that much of the irritation existing in the minds of European colonists against the whole Indian population of the colony has been excited by the undoubted ability of these Arab traders to compete with European merchants, and especially with those who have chiefly directed their attention to the supply of articles, notably rice, largely consumed by the Indian immigrant population. We are of opinion that these Arab traders have been drawn to Natal by the presence therein of those Indians who have been introduced under the immigration laws. Rice is the chief food of the 30,000 Indian immigrants now in the colony, and these astute traders have so successfully devoted their tact and energy to the supply of that article that the price to all consumers fell from 21 cents per bag in former years to 14 cents in 1884. It is said that Kafirs can buy from Arabs at from 25 to 30% lower rates than those obtaining 6 or 7 years ago. It does not lie within the scope of our commission to discuss at length the restrictive measure which some desire to impose upon Asiatics or Arab traders. We are content to place on record our strong opinion, based on much observation, that the presence of these traders has been beneficial to the whole colony, and that it would be unwise, if not unjust, to legislate to their prejudice. 8. Nearly all of them are Mohammedans, sither total abstainers from alcoholic liquors or drinking them in moderation. They are thrifty by nature and submissive to the law. Out of the 72 European witnesses who gave their evidence before the commission, almost every one of those who spoke as to the presence of the Indian affecting the colony has said that he is indispensable for its welfare. I have quoted the extracts at some length not to argue therefrom that the Indians should have the franchise, they have it already, but to refute the charge that the Indian is an intruder and the statement that he has nothing to do with the prosperity of the colony. The proof of the pudding lies in the eating. The best proof is that, no matter what is being said against the Indians, they are yet wanted. The Protector's Department is unable to cope with the demand for Indian labor. At page 5 of the Annual Report, 1895, the Protector says, "At the dose of last year, there was an unsupplied balance of 1,330 men to complete the year's indent. In addition to this number, 2,760 men were applied for to arrive in 1895, making a total of 4,090. Of this number, 2,032 arrived during the year under report, 1,049 from Madras and 983 from Calcutta, leaving a balance of 2,058, less 12 men lapsed requisitions, to arrive during the present year to complete the last year's indent. If the Indian is really harmful to the colony, the best and the justest method is to stop further immigration, and in due course, the present Indian population will cease to trouble the colony much. To have them under conditions that mean slavery is hardly fair." If then this appeal has at all satisfactorily answered the various objections raised to the Indian franchise, if the reader accepts the assertion that the franchise agitation on the part of the Indians is merely a protest against degradation, which the counter-agitation contemplates, and not an attempt to gain political power or influence, I humbly think I am justified in asking the reader to pause and consider before he decides to oppose the Indian franchise tooth and nail. Although the British subject idea has been rejected by the press as a craze and fad, I have to fall back upon that idea. Without it, there would have been no franchise agitation whatever. Without it, there would probably have been no state-aided immigration. Very probably the Indian would have been an impossibility in Natal if he were not a British subject. I, therefore, appeal to every Briton in South Africa not to lightly dismiss the British subject idea from his mind. The proclamation of 1858 was Her Majesty's Act, presumably approved of by her subjects. For it was done, not arbitrarily, but according to the advice of her then advisers, in whom the voters, by their votes, had reposed their full trust. India belongs to England, and England does not wish to lose her hold of India. Every act done by a Briton towards an Indian cannot but have some effect in molding the final relations between Britons and Indians. It is, moreover, a fact that the Indian is in South Africa because he is a British subject. He has to be tolerated whether one likes it or not. Is it not then better that nothing should be done that would unnecessarily embitter the feelings between the two communities? By coming to a hasty conclusion, or by forming conclusions on groundless assumptions, it is not at all unlikely that injustice may unintentionally be done to the Indians. The question in the minds of all reasonable men, I submit, should be not how to drive away the Indians from the colony, for that is impossible, but how to bring about satisfactory relations between the two communities. Even from a most selfish point of view, I submit, no good can result from an attitude of unfriendliness and hatred towards the Indians, unless there is any pleasure in creating in one's mind an unfriendly feeling towards one's neighbor. Such a policy is repugnant to the British Constitution and the British sense of justice and fair play, and above all hateful to the spirit of Christianity, which is professed by the objectors to the Indian franchise. I appeal more particularly to the press, the public men throughout South Africa, and the clergy. Public opinion is in your hands. You mold and guide it. It is for you to consider whether the policy hitherto pursued is the right and proper one to continue. Your duty as Britons and leaders of public opinion cannot be to divide the two communities, but to weld them together. The Indians have many blemishes, and they are themselves, no doubt, to blame to some extent for the present unsatisfactory state of feelings between the two peoples. My object is to induce you to believe that the blame does not entirely lie on one side alone. Often and often have I read in the papers and heard that the Indians have nothing to complain about. I submit that neither you nor the Indians here are capable of forming an impartial judgment. I, therefore, draw your attention entirely to the outside public opinion, to the press, alike in England and India, which is practically unanimous in coming to the conclusion that the Indians have a reasonable ground for complaint. And in this connection, I beg to deny the statement that has been often made that the outside opinion is based on exaggerated reports sent from South Africa by the Indians. I venture to claim to know something about the reports sent to England and India, and I have no hesitation in saying that the reports sent almost invariably err on the side of underestimation. Not a single statement has been made which cannot be substantiated by unimpeachable evidence. But the most remarkable fact is that there is no dispute as to facts which are admitted. The outside opinion based on those admitted facts is that the Indians are not fairly treated in South Africa. I will quote only one extract taken from a radical newspaper, The Star. The opinion of the soberest journal in the world, The Times, is known to everyone in South Africa. The Star of 21st October, 1895, commenting upon the deputation that waited on Mr. Chamberlain, says, "These particulars are enough to throw light upon the hateful persecution to which British Indian subjects are being subjected. The new Indian Immigration Law Amendment Bill, which virtually proposes to reduce Indians to a state of slavery, is another example. The thing is a monstrous wrong, an insult to British subjects, a disgrace to its authors, and a slight upon ourselves. Every Englishman is concerned to see that the commercial greed of the South African trader is not permitted to wreak such bitter injustice upon men who, alike by proclamation and by statute, are placed upon an equality with ourselves before the law. If I could but convince you that the greatest kindness is not shown to the Indian in South Africa, and that the Europeans are also to blame for the prevailing state of things, a way will have been paved for a dispassionate discussion of the whole Indian question. And perhaps it will be solved, without any intervention from Downing Street, to the satisfaction of both the parties concerned. Why should the clergy remain silent on this momentous question? Momentous, because it affects the future of South Africa. They do take part in politics pure and simple. They do attend the meetings convened to urge the disfranchisement of the Indians. But this is not merely a political question. Will they see a race degraded and insulted because of the unreasoning prejudice against it and sit still? Is such indifference sanctioned by Christ's Christianity? I repeat again, it is not political power that the Indians want. It is degradation. It is many other consequences and measures that will flow from and will be based on the disfranchisement that they dread and resist. In conclusion, I shall be deeply indebted to those who would read this and be kind enough to express their opinion about its subject matter. Many Europeans have privately expressed their sympathy for the Indians and have strongly disapproved of the sweeping resolutions passed at the various meetings held in the colony in connection with the Indian franchise and the bitter tone of the speeches made. If these gentlemen will come forward and have the courage of their convictions, I submit, they will have a fourfold reward. They will earn the gratitude of the 40,000 Indians in the colony, indeed of the whole of India, and will render true service to the colony by disabusing the minds of the Europeans of the notion that the Indian is a curse to the colony. They will serve humanity by rescuing or assisting to rescue a portion of an ancient race from unwarranted persecution, which they know exists in the whole of South Africa. And last but not least, in common with the noblest Britons, be the forgers of the links that will unite England and India in love and peace. I humbly submit that such an achievement is worth a little ridicule that the pioneers will be subjected to. To separate the two communities is easy enough. To unite them by the silken cord of love is equally difficult. But then, everything that is worth having is also worth a great deal of trouble and anxiety. The Natal Indian Congress has been mentioned in connection with this matter and has been much misrepresented. In a separate pamphlet, its objects and methods of working will be fully discussed. While this was in course of preparation, Mr. Maydon made a speech at Belair, and a curious resolution was passed at the meeting. With the greatest deference to the honorable gentleman, I venture to take exception to his statement that the Indians have ever remained in a state of servitude and are therefore unfit for self-government. Although he invoked the aid of history in support of his statement, I venture to say that history fails to bear out the statement. In the first place, Indian history does not date from the invasion of Alexander the Great. But I take the liberty to say that India of that date will compare very favorably with Europe of today. In support of that statement, I beg to refer him to the Greek description of India at pp. 169-70 of Hunter's Indian Empire, partly quoted in my open letter. What, however, of India of a period previous to that date? History says that the Aryans' home was not India, but they came from Central Asia, and one family migrated to India and colonized it, the others to Europe. The government of that day was, so history says, a civilized government in the truest sense of the term. The whole Aryan literature grew up then. The India of Alexander's time was India on the decline. When other nations were hardly formed, India was at its zenith, and the Indians of this age are descendants of that race. To say, therefore, that the Indians have been ever under servitude is hardly correct. India certainly has not proved unconquerable. If that be reason for disfranchisement, I have nothing to say except this, that every nation will, unfortunately, be found wanting in this respect. It is true England wafts her scepter over India. The Indians are not ashamed of that fact. They are proud to be under the British crown, because they think that England will prove India's deliverer. The wonder of all wonders seems to be that the Indians, like the favored nation of the Bible, are irrepressible in spite of centuries of oppression and bondage. And many British writers think that India is under England with her consent. Professor Seeley says, "The nations of India have been conquered by an army, of which, on the average, a fifth part was English. In the early battles of the Company, by which its power was decisively established, at the siege of Arcot, at Plassey, at Buxar, there seems always to have been more sepoys than Europeans on the side of the Company. And let us observe further, that we do not hear of the sepoys fighting ill, of the English as bearing the whole brunt of the conflict. But, if once it is admitted that the sepoys always outnumbered the English, and that they kept pace with the English in efficiency as soldiers, the whole theory, which attributes our success to an immeasurable natural superiority in valor, falls to the ground. Digby's India for the Indians and for England. The Honorable Gentleman One is also reported to have said, "We, the colonists, were entrusted with responsible government in Natal under certain circumstances. These have now become absolutely changed, brought about by your refusal to sanction our bill. You have brought about a condition of things that is so fraught with danger that it is our clear duty to hand back to you the authority which you gave us." How contrary to facts is all this? It assumes that the home government are now trying to thrust the Indian franchise on the colony, while the fact is that the responsible government is trying to materially alter the circumstances which existed at the time it was granted. Would not Downing Street be justified in saying, "We entrusted you with responsible government under certain circumstances. These have now become absolutely changed, brought about by your bill of last year. You have brought about a condition of things that is so fraught with danger to the whole British Constitution and British notion of justice, that it is our clear duty not to allow you to trifle with the fundamental principles on which the British Constitution is based." The time when the responsible government was accepted was, I submit, the time when Mr. Maiden's objection might have been valid. Whether responsible government would ever have been granted had the European colonists insisted upon disfranchisement of the Indians is another question. M.K. Gandhi. From a pamphlet printed by T.L. Cullingworth, printer, 40 Field Street, Durban, 1895. Dear listeners, this is the famous article called The Indian Franchise, an appeal to every Briton in South Africa. Thank you for listening to Mahatma Gandhi Letters.